الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على آله وصحبه وسلم أجمعين. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد وبارك وسلم. نويت التعلم والتعليم والتذكر والتذكير والنفع والانتفاع والإفادة والاستفادة والحث على التمسك بكتاب الله وسنة رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم والدعاء على الهدى والدلالة على الخير وكل ما نواه مشايخنا ابتغاء وجه الله مرضاته وثواب قربه سبحانه وتعالى. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So we begin, inshallah, in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as always with the intention of first praising Him, sending salawat upon our beloved sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and having the intention to learn and to teach and to remind and to be reminded and to benefit, give benefit and to take benefit, and all of the intentions that our teachers have, ultimately for the rida and the contentment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Inshallah, what we'll be covering today, and we'll keep this week's short, just given it's almost the holiday weekend, and there's not as many people as well. What we talked about last week was a continuation of the book that we've been covering, right, about prophetic character, about him sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And last week was specifically about the beautification of the heart and how that is more significant and leads to far better results and far more happiness for someone than for somebody who spends the entirety of their life beautifying their outward form. And one of the lines we covered was of a poem from Imam Haddad. And one Imam Haddad, who we talked about, is one of the great Imams of this tradition, and he talked about how a person who is beautifying their outward form solely, in reality what they're doing is preparing themselves for the worms that are going to ultimately consume them in the grave. So all of that effort, all of that struggle and that striving is not even for yourself, but it's for the worms that are going to consume you. Right? And so that's what we covered last week. What we'll cover this week, inshallah, is for those of you who have the book, and if anybody wants to be a reader today, you're welcome. Inshallah. We'll have it doesn't have to be one of the guys. We had the girls last time, but whoever wants to read for us. Any volunteers? No?
I can do it.
Yeah, so if you don't have a copy on your own, but you're welcome to take the book. We'll start from chapter 3. Assalamu alaikum. So maybe just open to chapter 3 and we'll begin with that.
Someone on patience?
Yes, chapter 3. Assalamu alaikum.
Should I start?
Yeah, you can, and read loud so they're able to hear you as well.
Alright. The greatness of patience, the foundation upon which the realities of faith are built. The attribute of patience, sabr, is one of the most important character traits which the prophets nurtured in their disciples. Allah adorned them with patience so that they would be an example to others, and He praises those who are patient. He says in his book, in reference to the Prophet Ayyub alayhi salam, "We did indeed find him patient, how excellent a slave. He was ever turning in repentance to his Lord." He also says, "Truly, those who endure with patience will be rewarded without measure, and he who is patient and forgiving, that truly is an affair that requires great resolve."
So we'll pause there, inshallah. So the verses that were just recited were in relation to Ayyub alayhi salam, right? Who can share a very brief synopsis of the story of Ayyub alayhi salam? And nobody has to raise their hand. You can just go forward. Mm-hmm.
He's a prophet, I think, especially characterized by his great difficulty in the amount of years that he went through severe sickness.
Mm-hmm. And do you remember what his sickness was?
I do not.
So Ayyub alayhi salam in particular, right, had almost like the boils on his skin, to the point where people couldn't even, the same people that loved him and spent time with him in his community, that he helped, he dedicated his life to helping, they couldn't even visit him. Like a lot of them couldn't even see him because they were almost disgusted, right, by what he saw. And this is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This was one of the biggest tests that he tested his prophets ﷺ with. And we know that from the hadith of the beloved ﷺ that he tells us that the people who are going to be tested the most, right, and many of us know this hadith, are number one, the prophets, right, and then the people closest to him after that, and then the people who are closest after that. Meaning, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says this in many different ayat of the Quran, that do you think that you'll be able to just say, I believe, right? And that you're not going to be tested. And of the things that he says he's going to test us with, he says, in particular, he calls out wealth and children many times, right? In many different, al-mal wal-banun zinatul hayatid dunya, right? That al-mal, your wealth, wal-banun, your children, are the adornments of the world, right? Zinatul hayatid dunya. And in particular, because those are things that people are attached to by nature, right? By their inclination. No matter how hard you try to detach yourself from that, you're going to have an inkling of that in your heart. And some of you may be able to speak to this, and I'll share from my personal experience, that when you see somebody who is tested with those things in particular, and in particular their children, right? And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us from tests like this, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself recognizes that this is the greatest test, both from the ayat in the Quran and from what he taught his Habib sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So much so that there's a specific hadith, right? And this is the beauty of our religion, that it's not just generic aphorisms and generic like be patient and you'll be rewarded type of ayat, which alone would be guidance, right? These are beautiful things. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he sends his wisdom in the form of very specific events as well. And how many of you know the hadith of what happens when you lose a child? Does anybody know that specific hadith? There are some, yes, narrations on that. Somebody else was saying? Yes. The one that is very well known, right, is that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes the child, right, of somebody away, he asks the angels, right, and I'm paraphrasing again the hadith, but this is a sahih hadith, that he asks the angels, have you taken the apple of my eye, or of their eye, right, meaning, and anybody who knows balagha in Arabic or who knows any form of metaphor, right, when you're saying the apple of your eye, it's like the core thing that your attention is towards. It's the greatest thing that you have in your possession. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one calling the child that, right? And then the angels respond in the affirmative and they say yes. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks and says, well, how did that person respond? And they say that they responded with patience and they responded with hamd and praise of you. In other words, in the way that you deserve to be praised. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he continues and he tells them, and this is very similar to one of the narrations that you mentioned, if not the same one, I can't recall, but what the reward for them will be, right? That I am pleased with them and that they will be able to enter Jannah and basically have anything and everything that their heart desires, right? And that is the reward for losing your child. And the fact that there's a hadith for losing your child, and the Prophet ﷺ went through this, right? Is a very beautiful thing. And I know, there are certain people that, very close friends with. In fact, so many. Just a month or two ago, I was at the funeral of my own friend that I spent my entire childhood, right, with, and he's my age, 26, 27 years old. And he didn't wake up one morning, right? And the fact that, that I remember growing up, and I wasn't that close to, to him anymore in the sense of, once you get past a certain part in your life, people go to college and they go do their own thing, but it doesn't mean the love isn't there, right? And the one thing that I remember so particularly about him was the amount of love and depth of love that his parents had for him. And I remember almost being jealous as a kid to go and just see the way that his parents would spoil him and shower him with love. And alhamdulillah, all of us have very blessed parents and we're very blessed to have that. But there was a special connection that especially his father had with him that I hadn't seen in most of my relationships. And to see how devastated they were, I'd never not seen his father smiling in the entirety of my life. And that is a tremendous, this is from the akhlaq of the Prophet ﷺ, that to hide your sorrows in private and to be somebody who is cheerful in public so you're not burdening them with your burdens. Because all of us go through difficult things. All of us go through difficult things. But the sunnah of the Rasul ﷺ is that we don't burden other people with that. And that's very different from the environment that you see us in. That when you have a problem, the first thing you want to do is to let other people know you have a problem, right? And what does that do? It brings down the energy. It doesn't show sensitivity to the things that they're going through. Not that, to diminish your problems, but not everybody's not your therapist, right? As they tell you. And it's okay to sympathize and to share with people who are going to be receptive to it. But I just remember that in particular. And I mentioned that because I don't know if it's a byproduct of the time that we live in, but you see this happening a lot. A lot of people losing their children, a lot of people, and again, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us from this, but recognizing these are realities and that it could happen to any single one of us. As one of my teachers said, that there's no thing in life that should ever come to you that should ever be a surprise. Right? A surprise is something by virtue of that you didn't prepare for it. You didn't expect it to happen. Right? When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's given us the guidance of anything and everything that possibly could happen and how to react to that. And that's a beautiful thing because people don't have that. When they go through a tremendous loss, they don't know how to frame it. They don't know how to grapple with it. They don't know why it happened, what's going to happen after. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, through His ni'mah and through His ahkam, has given us this knowledge. And that's particularly important to keep in mind, whether it's that specific instance that we talked about or any of the difficulties that we go through. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alleviate all of us and the entire ummah of the difficulties that we're going through. But that there's a reason for all of it. And not only is there a reason for it, but that there is a tremendous wisdom in, how many of you have heard of, I think we talked about this in the first class, but one of the great ulama, one of the great shuyukh known as Ibn Ata'illah Secondary. Has anybody heard of that name before? Assalamu alaikum. Nobody? Okay. Do you know? Do you want to share with the class who he is? Do you want to share with the class who he is, or you just heard of the name? Yes, exactly. So this was one of the great, more recent, not necessarily recent, but not somebody at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, right? One of the great scholars who dedicated his life, as many of them do, to getting closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he has a book named the Book of Wisdoms, right? The Book of Wisdoms, known as the Aphorisms. Anybody who, it's a staple in every person's bookshelf. Everyone should have it. It's one of those books that you read once, you flip open a page, you'll learn tremendous wisdom from it. 20 years you come back, you read the same exact thing, and you learn something new from it, right? Because all it is it's a reflection on the Quran and the Hadith. And in it, he has one of his aphorisms that he reflects, and he says, along the lines of, if a person knew of the tremendous gifts, and he says gifts in particular, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala places in difficulty, that they would never want anything except difficulty in their life. Right? And any of you who have been through this, who've been through a very difficult time in their life, whether it's, we talked about in the first class, whether it is, a job that you're looking for, a college that you're trying to get into, a person that you're trying to marry, and things don't work out the way that you always want them to work out. And when you endure that with patience, and that's what this chapter is on, right? فَصَبْرٌ جَمِيلٌ, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, that when you are patient, be patient beautifully, with beautiful patience. Right? Not in a questioning manner. He knows that these are natural things. He knows these are ways people respond. But when you respond like that, one of the ayahs that got me through some of the most difficult times in my life was when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the 28th juz, right? I think it's Surah Mumtahana. And many of you may have heard this, that he says, وَمَن يَتَّقِ اللَّهَ يَجْعَلْ لَهُ مَخْرَجًا. That a person who has taqwa of Allah, وَمَن يَتَّقِ اللَّهَ يَجْعَلْ لَهُ مَخْرَجًا. That for that person, he will create a way out. He will create a way out of that difficulty for that person. But then he continues and he says, وَيَرْزُقْهُ مِنْ حَيْثُ لَا يَحْتَسِبْ. And rizq, we know this word, right? وَيَرْزُقْهُ, that he will provide rizq from مِنْ حَيْثُ لَا يَحْتَسِبْ, from places that you never would have even imagined. Right? And a lot of times when we think about ghaib, right? When we think about the unseen, we think about it in the context of the akhirah. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us here is you're going to see that in this world. You're going to see the things behind the scenes. You may not see those things, but you're going to see Him creating opportunities that you never would have imagined or thought of. And when you hold on to that and you believe that that's true, I promise you, and it's not a promise from me, it's a promise from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And this has happened so many times in my life, that you hold a good opinion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that you recognize the thing that you wanted didn't happen for a reason, whether it's 1 year down the line, 2 years, 4 years, even 10 years down the line. You look back and you look at the doors that He opened for you. And you're like, if I put all of my effort into what I wanted, I would have missed out on all of this that was way better for me. Right? And many of you know this. This is something that's happened in all of your lives. And so this is a byproduct of patience. And when we think about the prophets, alayhi salatu wassalam, one of the ahkam and the wisdoms that we know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent them to us for is not only sending us the message, but also as a way to relate to them. Right? And I remember when one of my teachers told me this, it blew my mind, because sometimes we think about the prophets in terms of, in terms of things like being thrown out of their city, being verbally abused, and all of these things that all of them had to deal with. But any difficulty that you can possibly imagine in your life, any single one, right, that you could possibly imagine could have happened in your life, there was a prophet who went through that thing. And that is from the wisdom of Allah. Right? As far as saying, and this is in particular important for the women, right? That there are certain times there are people who have a really big desire to have, for example, children, right, in their life that we just talked about. There are prophets who went through the same difficulty of not being able to have or conceive children. And we don't think about that sometimes, right? The Zakaria alayhi salam, that he wanted children for 70, 80 plus years. And that any normal, sane person would say, my biological clock is at 30 years old, I'm not going to have a chance, 40, 50. How many people do we know? This is even today. I know people who at 50 years old, right, or 60 years old just had a child. And that's a miracle by any means you can define it. Science will tell you whatever they want you to tell you, right? But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the cause and the effect. But that there are prophets who went through that very same thing. And then imagine, right, even, for example, in these days that we're in, right, in the Hijjah, that this is a reminder of the sacrifice that they, alayhi salatu wasalam, went through. That Ibrahim, alayhi salam, imagine all of that, and in his older age too, taking your family to the desert, being tested with, leaving them to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He wasn't leaving them, as some people think, right, to die or alone. No, he left them in the trust of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that he took care of them. We know this is what we commemorate even today. But to be able to be asked to sacrifice your own child, right? That these are big tests and very big blessings. Big tests and very big difficulties that if you see it with the right perspective, that you recognize, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will get you through all of it. All of it. He put you in that situation, that He will take you out of that situation. Right? And that's just a reminder, first and foremost, to myself and to every single one of us, because this is one of the most cliche topics, right? We talk about patience. Everyone knows you got to be patient, right? But when you look at the examples of people who responded beautifully, it gives you a special type of himmah. And I remember, this before I get to that, right? There's a big question that people ask sometimes, that how do I know whether a difficulty or that is put upon me is a test or if it is a punishment? Does anybody know the answer to that? Because we're told that sometimes, right? It can get confusing because you're told it's a test from Allah, but you're also told it's a punishment for your sin.
You don't know?
There are signs that the scholars say are indications for you to know, but there's no you're right, there's no concrete way to know necessarily in the moment. But does anybody else have a different? It doesn't have to be an answer, but just an opinion. Yeah.
Wouldn't any punishments still be a sort of blessing for you, because if you endure it with patience, you'll still reward?
But that's if you endure it with patience, right?
Yeah.
And you're getting there. You're very close. Yes.
Is it dependent on how you react?
Yes, it's a very big one.
Brings you closer to Allah.
Very good, very good. So, the ulama, they tell you that when you're tested with something, that if it ultimately brings you closer to Allah, it was a test. And if it ultimately turns you away from Him, right, and you begin questioning, why did this happen? If I did this wouldn't have happened. Then that's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala punishing you. And when you recognize that, you still have, from His mercy, the ability to turn back to Him. There's no such thing as a punishment from Allah, except that you can even turn that into a blessing. And what a blessing that is, right? The fact that it's not this, we talked about this concept of sunk costs, right? You make a mistake once, you're done for, right? There's no recompense. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He gives you those opportunities, even if it's at the end of your life, so long as it's not your soul leaving your body in your last breaths, you have the ability to turn back even then. And that's such a beautiful thing, because, and again, I'm speaking from a personal experience, unfortunately, but also many people have gone through this, that how many times do you meet people who, no matter what it is, even if it's the lightest thing, even if you accidentally looked at them the wrong way, that they can't let go of it. They will never forget it for the entirety of their life. And some of you are laughing because you've been through this, right? And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it easy and forgive them and forgive all of us. But this is a human nature, that you have a tendency that if somebody has done something wrong that you want to, hold on to it. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He doesn't hold on to anything. any time that you want to turn back to him, even if you've done, we know the hadith. How many of you know the hadith of it's the famous one of the man who killed 99 people? Right, does anybody want to share that with us in a brief version? Do you want to share it with us? Yeah.
I want to give someone else the opportunity.
Okay. I'll just share it very briefly, right? But it's a very famous hadith that there was a person who killed 99 people, and before even the hadith starts, you can imagine, right, that this is the fact that, again, there's something, because it's a very real thing. Again, unfortunately, in the time that we live in, there's people who have done this, right? There's people who have done the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks to even people who have done this enormous of a sin. And that he killed 99 people, and he goes to a scholar and he says, will Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive me? And that person says, are you out of your mind? Right? You killed 99 people. Like, do you think you have a chance? And this obviously wasn't a person who was that knowledgeable, because he would have known the answer. And so what does the man do? He kills him too. So now he's killed 100 people. He goes to another person and he asks him the same question. It's kind of like what some people do today, right? You don't hear the answer you want, you go ask somebody else hoping to hear what you want. And again, another blessing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He gives these different opinions to people that are rooted in the Quran and the Sunnah, that it's a mercy to us, that we benefit from all of it. Although we shouldn't do that. I'm not advising to do that, right? But if it so happens, then that's with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But he asked him the same person, I've killed 100 people, do I have a chance? And he says, that you know the gravity of what you've done, right? But at the end of the day, if you turn back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and there's 3 conditions for tawbah, right? It's being sincere, it's turning back to Him, and being remorseful, right? So not only are you asking Him for forgiveness, but you have a sincerity in your heart that you feel bad for what you've done. And you would be surprised at the number of people that, whether it's, and I don't want to use this as an example because hopefully that will never ever be applicable to us in the entirety of our lives, but as much as if you've harmed someone, there's people who literally don't have it in their heart to feel bad. And that's just, it's a veiling of the heart, and we ask for protection from that. But that you feel remorseful, and the third one is you resolve to never do it again, right? And he told this person that if you're sincere, you make tawbah to Allah, and you go to a place where you're not going to be surrounded by influences that are ever going to make you do that again. And this person, he gets on his way. He doesn't even get to the land he's trying to get to. He's trying to escape from his environment. He's on his way, and while he's on his way, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decrees for him to pass away. And so then the question becomes, when his soul gets taken, is this person being taken to Jannah or to Jahannam? Right? Because he's killed 100 people, and he did tawbah, but he didn't meet the full conditions. Right? He didn't escape. Right? He didn't get to go where he needed to be. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, again, by His mercy, He tells the angels, measure the distance between where he left to where he was going. And the angels do it. And what do they find? They find that he actually isn't even halfway there. He's short. So again, by logic, I take that back. Yes, they measure it, he's short. And so by logic, he's supposed to be going to Jahannam, right? He's done atrocious things. There's so many other hadith of the Prophet ﷺ telling us about the story of people where there's actually, I believe, 2 hadith, and again, I'm not quoting the specific ones because I have to look back, of a person who was killed, and the killer meeting in Jannah and laughing that they find themselves in Jannah, because there's a person who was killed and a person who killed him. By logic, one of them has to be in Jahannam, right? We won't get into that. We'll talk about an explanation, because people, not in our class obviously, but not to use this as something to spend too much time to talk about. But what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does is He stretches the land so that the person actually ends up on the other half by His mercy, just so that He could forgive him. This is the mercy, this is the forgiveness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so that person enters Jannah, right? And so anybody who tells you that you've done anything too wrong, even if your own self tells you that you've done too many things, that you have no chance, these are all whisperings from shaitan. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the hadith Qudsi, right, that a person who turns back to Him, that even if their sins are as big as the foam of the sea, that He will forgive them. And many other hadith that a person who turns back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in repentance, that He is more happy for that to welcome that person or to forgive that person than a person who's lost in the desert and loses everything and is without water or any of his belongings, and he finds his camel or finds his belongings. Hey, imagine being in the desert with nothing and you think you're done. right? And you finally see, okay, wait, I'm actually going to live another day because I found my things. And these are all just reminders for ourselves that there's no such thing as too many mistakes. There's no such thing as too many mistakes, and do not ever let anybody tell you that that is such a thing. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He is Ar-Rahman, He is Al-Ghafur, He is the one who will forgive everything. And what were we trying to get to? So basically, one of the other stories, right, we're talking about patience. And the way that you respond to difficulty, patiently. And I remember when I was in Tarim, studying with my teacher, who we're going through his book, right, Habib Umar. There was a story that they told us of one time they were in the desert, and anybody who's been to like Dubai or Saudi or anybody like any place like that, you know that there's sandstorms, right? You know that, and it's actually really like magnificent when you see it. Like you're driving in the roads, and all of a sudden the skies are just brown, right? Like you can't see anything. And they're driving and they're going through a sandstorm, and the cars all get stuck. They're all like stopped and they get stuck, and they all get out, and everybody's like, they're late for whatever they had to travel to. It was a very important meeting, and everyone's like, oh, if this didn't happen, or how are we going to get there, and all of this. And they look at Habib, they look at their teacher, right, and they just see him smiling, not saying anything. He's just smiling in the middle of a sandstorm. I want you to imagine, right? Like, use your imagination that you've got basically like a turban blowing in the wind, right? And like you've got these thobes, and that you can't see anything except sand, and everyone's like, you know, disheveled, trying to get their sand off of their head and off of their body and out of their mouth. And you just see somebody who's just standing there, like soaking it in, right? Just like looking at it, getting smacked in the face by sand, and he's just smiling. And this is from the akhlaq of the beloved Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, that he taught us this. And what he said after that stuck with all of them. That he said, whatever is from the beloved, meaning Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is beloved. Right? Whatever is from the beloved is beloved. And if we think about that from that framework, that anything he tests us with, that we endure it patiently. And we know the hadith of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, that how wondrous is the affair of the believer. That when he's tested with difficulty, there's goodness for him, right? And when he's given good, that there's goodness for him, that he's grateful for it and he's given goodness in it. So there's no such thing as a test that is going to, number one, be more than you can bear, and number two, not be good for you. Right? There's no such thing as a test that can't be good for you, and that's a blessing. And we'll continue, inshallah. That these are just, again, reminders for ourselves. Do you want to continue on from the next paragraph?
The second paragraph?
Yes.
His prophet, the chosen one, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, mentioned the reward of patience when mentioning the virtues of the month of Ramadan. It is the month of patience, and paradise is the reward for patience. Allah confirmed this in His book, describing this people of paradise. The angels enter upon them from every gateway, saying, "Peace be upon you for what you have borne with patience. How excellent is the final abode."
You can pause there. Right? This is just another reminder, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala telling us that there is nothing more beloved to Him than a person who is patient, who's enduring with that patience. And that means, by extension, it's one of the hardest things you can ever do. And if we've been through these difficult moments where it feels like there's seemingly no end, you know this is like a mental burden or like a certain cognition that there's no way to reason yourself out of it. There are certain things that you just have to tough it out and pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes care of it. Like there's no turning it into a good moment. There's certain things that are just very, very difficult, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala recognizes that. Right? And I've had, again, other friends or family friends, there's somebody in particular that I know that, and this happens I want you to think about this in particular, right? That these difficult moments, typically the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that He tests you after He gives you a lot of blessings. Right? So for a person to say that I had all of this and I lost all of this, why did this happen? No, this is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala telling you that this is going to happen. He's telling you He's going to test you with it. Right? So we have to prepare for it. And this is why even one of the companions, radiallahu anhu, they asked the Prophet ﷺ that mata sa'a, right? That when is the hour? In other words, like, how much can I enjoy of my time here? Right? All of these blessings that I've been given, And think about preparing later. And how does he respond? Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, that what have you prepared for? And this is one of the core reasons why we're here, and I can speak only to myself that I haven't prepared much for it, right? And life is short and time is short. And that's will only become real when you start to realize people your own age and even people younger than you see them and you're at their janazas. And you think that, and you hear this so often, that he was so young, she was so young, right? And then you see it happen the next day and the next day. And it doesn't hit us here in particular because our communities are smaller. But when you go to a place like Saudi, or even like to the Haram, or for Umrah, or for, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us all to go repeatedly, inshallah. It's one of the things you ask somebody, what was something that was so impactful to you, right? Or hit you. And they'll tell you that there was a janazah after every single salah. Right? Because you're not used to that here. Maybe once a month, once a year you'll go. But over there you got 5, 10, hundreds of people in every locality because everybody is Muslim. Right? And then they say, they'll tell you if it's an atfal, right? If it's a child, and you hear it daily, every single day. And these are things we lose reminders for because we're not in that. So we have to. There's another sunnah, right? Again, of the Prophet ﷺ, to visit the graveyard every so often, to remind ourselves of that. And what I was talking about, right, was this is again somebody that we're very close to, that he was, imagine going through the motions of life. That number one, you get out of, the country that you're trying to get out of, right? Whether, for most of us, it's like India, Pakistan, etc., where a lot of our parents are from. And you make it to a place like the US, and you're like, I made it, right? And then you become a doctor, which is one of the hardest things that you can do. And you establish a successful career, and you do all of this, and alhamdulillah, you get married, and you have children, right? And you think you're at the peak of everything. Everything you could have wanted is now in front of you. And this is not one person, this is so many people, but in particular, this person I remember because it's probably one of the hardest things that, you can see someone go through. But that his wife gets cancer, right? And for those of you, when you get married, and inshallah, if you're close to your spouses, right? That's a very difficult thing to go through. Right? To see the person that you're closest to in your life struggle in such depth, right? And the depths of their struggle, and you feel helpless because there's nothing you can do. And that's the reality of it. We have no power or control. And I remember we used to take care of their kids. This was when I was only like 6 or 7 years old, and his kids one was my age, 6 or 7, and we'll get to what happens right later as well. And he has a younger brother who's only 2 or 3, and I remember they would be over every single night, and we would take care of them, and that they wouldn't even know what was happening to their mother, right? So how do you tell your children what is happening? But not only that, how do you deal with your spouse going through it? And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive her and elevate her rank and grant her firdaus, inshallah, but she ends up passing away. And she was only in her 30s, maybe 40s, right? This is a very, very young couple. And life goes on, and you think that's one of the hardest things that you're going to go through, right? And you don't know what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has in store for you. And life goes on, and his youngest son that we were taking care of, again, one morning, and I can't remember the exact details again, but basically he also passes away, and he's only 10, right? 9 or 10. This is a few years after. And so now you're burying your child, right? And you think that's all you're going to go through, right? And this person, this is incredible. I can't imagine going through this, right? But you end up picking up your all of the things that you went through, and you turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and you recognize it's from him, and you move on with your life, right? You don't dwell on it. And he moves on, and he gets married again, and he has stepchildren in that relationship, right? And what happens is, one morning, basically one of those stepchildren has a freak accident, and she passes away too. This is the second child that you're bearing, right? And imagine the difficulty that a person is going through. But by means of that, how much your rank is being elevated with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One of the things that our teachers tell us is it's from the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He tests you because He wants a certain rank for you. And He knows that you can't get there yourself. You can't get there through your own ibadah. No matter how much you pray the entirety of your life, no matter how much adhkar that you do, no matter how many people that you help, no matter how much you repent to Him, Azza wa Jal, that He wants more than that for you. And so what He does to get you there is He tests you, because He wants closeness to Him. And anybody who's been through these tests, you can ask them, Right? You can ask them and they will tell you there's not a moment that I felt closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala except in those depths of those tests. Because there's no way to replicate that. And I speak again for myself that sometimes things are going good and you just become distracted. Right? You don't have the same level of intensity in your khushu or in your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but when He puts you to your knees, there is no choice you have except to turn to Him. But this person, we said he loses his second son, and just last year, right, it's been a year now, rahimahullah, that the person who was one of my friends, again, not somebody I was close to, but we grew up taking care of them and watching them grow up, and he was my age, again. He goes to the hospital for a heart attack. This is his last son. He goes to the hospital because he had a heart attack. And alhamdulillah, like after that, he comes out, and I literally remember this. He posts that, he says God is great, like alhamdulillah, that, you never know what's going to happen to you, right? Because he talks about this heart attack that he had. Literally 2 or 3 days after, he has another heart attack and he passes away. Rahimahullah, that. And I'm just thinking from the eyes of the father, right? That imagine losing your wife and then your youngest son and then your stepdaughter and then your last son. Right? These are things that any sane, any normal person who doesn't have a way to deal with this would lose their mind. And we see this happen very frequently. I know people who have literally watched, and I don't want to get, too far into this, but have watched their children pass away in ways that they, visually cannot forget. Right? And this is one of the biggest difficulties and tests that a person can be tested with, and they move on, and they recognize that this is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And I'm sharing all of this not just so that we become solemn or down, but we recognize it's from, that's what we say, right? Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. That it's from Allah and it goes back to Him. And that when things like this happen, that our gut reaction isn't just, why did He test me with this, right? Because He tested the Prophet ﷺ. He wouldn't have tested the Prophet ﷺ with it and tested you with it, except that He wants good for you. That the Prophet ﷺ buried the majority of his children in his own lifetime, right? Even the youngest one, Ibrahim. Right? We know that there was a hadith that when he was holding Ibrahim, which was his youngest son, and basically he feels him taking his last breaths. And he's an infant, he's a baby. And the companions, radiallahu anhum, that they walk in on this happening, and they see him weeping, they see him crying. And any other person, and this is also again not that they were of course criticizing him, they held him in the highest esteem, but rather they thought he was above the human nature of certain responses. And they see him crying, and they said, I believe this was Abdul Rahman ibn Auf, that he goes to him and he says, Ya Rasulullah, even you're crying when you're tested? And he looks and he points to Ibrahim and he says that this is indeed the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's how he responded. That he says, even this, my child being taken from me, that this is from the mercy, right, of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And how did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala elevate him because of that? And how many, even from the children that he had, right? Like he was given Hassan and Hussein, right? The most beloved people, grandchildren, in the eyes of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He will always replace what he has taken with something better. And this is one of the last hadith that we'll end with. We still have 20 minutes, but I want to save some time. Those of you who actually were here last week for the khutbah, one of my other teachers, Sada bin Evans, was giving the khutbah here at MEC, and he reminded me of this hadith that Salama, who was one of the later wives of the Prophet ﷺ, her husband was Abu Salama, and he was wounded in Uhud, right? The Battle of Uhud, which was one of the big battles in Muslim history, that they suffered a lot of losses, right? And he was wounded from this, and he eventually, on his deathbed, it became clear he was going to die. And Salama, his wife, was very attached to him. And before we even began the hadith, we learned so much from this, that how beautiful is a relationship that, let me continue and then we'll get to this point. But basically Abu Salama, he tells her that when you're being tested with something like this, and when I return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, say inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un, and make dua that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala replaces me with something that is better for you. right? With something that you've lost, with something that is better. And Salama, she's thinking about this, like these were his last words, and she's thinking about this, and she says, how can anyone possibly be better than my husband, my late husband? How can someone ever be possibly better than Abu Salama? And from this we learn alone that the character of the husbands of the wives, right, of the Sahabiya, right, from what they learned from the Prophet ﷺ, who told them that the best of you are those that are best to your families or to your wives in some narrations, and I am the best to my family. That they didn't even want to marry anyone else. This was in a tradition or in a society where people would get married not only young, but repeatedly, multiple times, right? That they were so close to one another and they treated each other so beautifully that they didn't even want to think about it. And these were real men, right? That the way that they took care of their wives. And what happens after, right, is Umar radiallahu anh, he proposes to her. And she says no. Imagine Umar radiallahu anh proposing to you and you saying no. Well, I guess it's somewhat reasonable because a lot of the women were scared of him, right, at that time. But this is Umar, right? This is somebody that the Prophet ﷺ vouched for. And then Abu Bakr radiallahu anh, he proposes to her and she says no. Now for that, I don't have a reason, right? I can't imagine somebody like Abu Bakr coming to you and you know this is somebody who's going to treat you better than you've ever been treated in your whole life. You know this is somebody who's going to give you anything and everything that he possibly can. But she says no. Because she's like, Abu Salama is literally the pinnacle. My husband, nobody can beat him. And then the Prophet ﷺ, out of his modesty and his haya, he comes to her. And by nature, when he was proposing to his wives, he was very humble. He was very modest. And she's thinking this, right? That how can somebody possibly be better? And that he goes to her and like hints at, like, you know, I am a prophet, right? Alayhi salatu wasalam. Right? Like, is that good for you? And that she picks up on this hint. And she says that, Ya Rasulullah, are you suggesting that you and I could be married? Are you suggesting that you and I could be in marriage together? And he responds, right? He responds in the affirmative. And she says, Ya Rasulullah, it's not that I don't have raghba, it's not that I don't have this desire or this desire to be in a marriage or a relationship with you, but rather I know myself and I know that this could never happen for 3 reasons. Even though you're asking me, right? The number 1, that I'm a jealous woman, right? And you've got multiple wives, and I don't think I can handle that. And she's being very real with him. And this tells you that the Sahabiya, right, that the women of his time not only could approach him and be real with him, but that they could reject him. Imagine rejecting the Prophet ﷺ, right, in marriage. And because they knew themselves. And this is what separates, as my teacher said, right, Rasulullah ﷺ from any egotistical leader, any maniac, any person who was exploitative in their exploitative in their nature. That he Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he spent his time in the service of other people, and he spent his time learning and knowing where people came from. And she says that, number 1, right, I have jealousy of, I'm a jealous woman. Number 2, I'm an older woman, right? I don't think that that's something that you could get better than that. And number 3 is that I have children. And she speaks so definitively. She's like, I have children, right? That means I have children and therefore we cannot be married, right? And the Prophet ﷺ, out of his beautiful, beautiful, beautiful akhlaq, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he says that as for the first one, that I'll make dua that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala removes that jealousy from you, right? He doesn't gloss over it. He doesn't brush over it. He doesn't say, don't worry about that, right? He says, I recognize the feelings that you have, and I'll do my best, right, to pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala removes that from you. And as for the second, that you being older, I'm old too. That's not a problem, right? Like, I'm an older guy too. And that's a connection, right? Because what he does there is 2 things. Number 1, he says, he draws an attention to something that she thinks is a defect, and he praises that. And that number 2, he glosses over the fact that she's alluding to he can be married to somebody younger, and he says, no, that's something that I don't see as an issue. I'm not going to choose somebody younger. I'm choosing you. And that number 3, and again, for those of you who are seeking marriage, this is a sunnah of the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and I have such admiration for people who are able to break past those certain norms that unfortunately many of us have been weighed down by, usually and I'll speak again from my own opinion, not from our own accord or choice, but by our cultures and where we come from. that it's a sunnah to marry someone that is older than you, right? And that if you get that opportunity, that's something you have to do, but not something you discount either. And for those of you who want to talk about that later, you can talk to me about that in private, inshallah. We'll talk about that now. But the third one, right? Then he says, as for you having children, I will look at your children as if they're my very own children, and I will treat them accordingly. So he responds and he affirms all of the things that she was hesitant about. And as we know, they end up, in getting married to one another. But I share that again because this goes back to patience in a few regards. Number one, that Salama lost her husband, and she had to be patient in trying to decipher basically what is being left for her, that something better is going to come, and she had no idea what that was. And that's the situation many of ourselves find ourselves in. We think something is so perfect and we lose it and we bash our head on it like we're never going to find something like that again. Recognize Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can create what you don't even know exists. And again, I'm speaking from an experience of that's happened to me many times. And I look back and I'm like, man, in the moment, I was like, I have to wait a whole year to figure this thing out. And like you look back and you're like, 4 years for some of the biggest things in your life to happen is nothing. Right? Something that's going to impact you, whether it's your job or your spouse, etc. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will take care of it. So that's number one. And number two, that she had to be patient. The Prophet ﷺ had to be patient. Right? In, again, being rejected and not realizing what it was that... And again, the ulama, what they say, just to be very clear, of why he wanted to marry her was specifically because of her children. So the biggest thing that she was concerned about, he wanted to marry her so that she knew that her children were taken care of. And so anybody, again, and when you look at the wives of the Prophet ﷺ, majority of them were elder women. So anybody who can claim that there was for any other intent, right? These were people that were divorced. These were people that were widowed. These were people that had children. These were people. Aisha radiallahu anha was his youngest wife. And also, when you read the seerah, it's actually really interesting because this is a whole other tangent. But I remember this blowing my mind because like people who make certain claims, right, about the Prophet ﷺ, they have no knowledge. They're speaking from a lens of they haven't even studied his life. Anybody who studied his life recognizes the premise or even the foundation of those claims is flawed, right? But that even he didn't even originally have an intent to marry Aisha radiallahu anha. Right? The reason, and for those of you who know, right, Jibreel alayhi salam came to him in a dream and showed that was something that was going to happen. Even then, he didn't know how to interpret it. Right, so people who claim, he could have made up that dream, etc. No, even then he didn't know how to interpret the dream because he never thought of that as a possibility. So much so when you read the seerah that Abu Bakr radiallahu anh, he didn't even think that the Prophet, he was getting ready to get Aisha radiallahu anha to marry to somebody else. He didn't even think about the Prophet ﷺ. Right, that blows my mind sometimes because this is somebody who the Prophet ﷺ calls out of affection Aish, right? And then a hadith that Amr ibn al-As, he comes to him, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and asks, who is the most beloved person to you? And he responds, it's Aisha, radiallahu anha. But that just goes, right, to thinking about the relationships that he, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, cultivated and the immense patience that he had. And we could spend a lifetime talking about the amount of trials that he went through, from Ta'if to the way that people, his own family, right, kicked him out. The patience he had with even like Abu Jahl, right, or Abu Lahab. Right, the people that, imagine your own uncles spending their entire lifetime trying to kill you, right? And what was even so much so that on the battlefield, they say that he was still making dua for Abu Jahl. When he was ready to defend himself and the Muslims were being killed, he was still making dua. And this is what they say, that when you have a true good intention is that you want the best for everyone, regardless of whether it's your friend or your enemy, that you're always making dua for them. You're always making dua for them. And the second you harbor a bad intent or a bad feeling for someone, you recognize you're doing something wrong. Right? And this is something that we remind ourselves with, and that we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to embody even a portion of the patience that He granted Him sallallahu alayhi wa sallam and any of the Anbiya alayhi salatu wassalam, that He allows that patience to be a means of nearness to Him azza wa jal, that He allows that patience to be a means of drawing nearer to Him and a means of receiving the hidden gifts and hidden blessings in that, and not a means of turning away from Him. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Inshallah, we'll end there. We have about 10 minutes. We can do questions, just so when we come back, we'll do our adhkar, our 10 minutes of adhkar after Maghrib. For those of you, right, who are aware, it's the first 10 days of Dhul Hijjah now, and basically 10 minutes is going to be the second day. The Prophet ﷺ said that there is no deed more beloved to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala except in these 10 days. Even greater than, sometimes some of the ulama say that in Ramadan itself. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَالْفَجْرِ وَلَيَالٍ عَشْرٍ, that when He swears by something, it means it holds immense weight. And the ulama say that وَلَيَالٍ عَشْرٍ is referring to these 10 nights. Because these were sacred days even before Islam came. Right? So this concept of a calendar, actually, my teacher was just telling me this last week, was actually designated by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? We didn't make up the 12 months. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually told us that. And these specific months, there's a few sacred months, are opportunities where we don't want to, if we have the ability to fast all of the 10 days, fast, but don't miss Arafah. And there's a hadith that the Prophet ﷺ says that person who fasts on Arafah, 2 years of their sins and their mistakes are forgiven. And all of Hajj is Arafah. That's a saying. All of Hajj is Arafah. So if we're not able to go for Hajj, we can still witness that. We can still use an opportunity to capitalize on that. And so there are special adhkar that from my teachers, again, these aren't from the sunnah necessarily, it's just sunnah to say, hamd and la ilaha illallah, etc., whatever adhkar that already hold weight. Those are general sunnahs that you should be doing, but there are special adhkar that some of the great scholars and salihin in the past, we posted in the WhatsApp as well. They're beautiful. They stuck with me because they're also very melodic. But we'll do that. It'll take, inshallah, just 10 or 15 minutes when we come back. But anybody have any questions? No questions? Okay. Yeah.
So in terms of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam's example, how do you incorporate his characteristics in your own life? Because it feels sometimes like for me, I feel like he's at such a high level that it's hard to, I guess, emulate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. That's the reason, right? That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran that trying to think of the ayah. There's a few ayats in the Quran, right? That a lot of the people, when they were sent the messengers, that they said, is this really a messenger that he's walking in the marketplace just like us? He's eating just like us, right? He's interacting in his community just like us. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala responds like, that's the reason, right? Like we sent the messengers as human beings, right? Because they're just like you. Alayhi salatu wassalam. And that's one of the wisdoms, right? That sometimes we think that they're at a certain lofty standard, and they are. They're at the highest standard. Right? This is Habibullah. This is the most beloved person to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We can't reach his rank, no matter how many lifetimes that we spend. But his example that he set, the closest thing we can do is learn about the different sunan, right? So one thing that I was neglectful and still am, right, for a long time, is you realize he defines what good character is, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? So even things that we might forget about because of the society we live in, like actually going out of your way for your neighbors, right? Not just on Eid, not just on Al-Hijjah. I still remember in winter, one of my neighbors would snowblow my driveway without me asking every single time. And then I felt ashamed because I was like, this person is doing it without me even asking. Not only that, they're not even Muslim and they're better Muslims than us, right? But he, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, taught us that. So how is it that we're not doing that for them? Right? Or when you move into a new place, sure, you can be shy, right? And like say, this is my place, I'm going to do, stay in my cocoon, do my bubble. No, but the sunnah of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam is you get to know the people who live around you, right? You learn these small little things, whether it's how to respond, right, in times of difficulty. That when we talked about Ta'if, right? If somebody, and this happens a lot to us, if somebody mistreats you, somebody abuses you even, somebody even slanders you or ruins your reputation, what's the response most people have? That they, like, I'm going to end this guy's life, right? Like, I'm going to do the same exact thing for him. Make sure that he never gets a chance to be able to say another word about me again, right? But what did the Prophet ﷺ do? That he says, Ya Allah, they don't know what they're doing. Right? They know not. Forgive them, for they know not. Right? He makes dua for them, and that he still holds a good opinion of the people that stoned him until the soles, right, of his sandals, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, were covered in blood. And he says, maybe that there will come a time where there will be people from their descendants that are going to listen and accept this message. Right? And so we learn about these things, and then we recognize it's the small things. It's not the huge things. It's not grand gestures going out of your way to make people feel like they're the... And yes, these are sunnahs too, right? But simple things like in that hadith we talked about when Amr ibn al-As asked him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who is the most beloved person to you? That when you look at some of these hadith, they don't just tell you what he said, they tell you what else they remembered. And what the thing they remembered was the level of attention that he gave them. They literally say in the riwayat before that, they say that he stopped what he was doing and that he turned till and they specify which body parts were facing them, right? Till his chest and his feet were facing me. And like, this is a habit that until I read those hadith, I realized even when I talk to people sometimes, that even if I think I'm giving them my full attention, by virtue of you being even pointed a different way or you being engaged in something else, you're not really giving them your full attention. So he was very intelligent in understanding how people felt. And so I share this because it's not the big things. It's learning the little mannerisms. It's learning about, right, when somebody treats you bad like we just talked about, that you don't just say, I'm never going to deal with this person again. But rather, you say, maybe he thinks this because maybe I did something wrong. Or maybe he thinks this because somebody else told him that and he doesn't really know. And so I'm going to sit down with him and talk to him. Or I'm just going to forgive him and not bring it up again. Right? And so these little small things that are very real things. There's a reason they're sunnah. And when we forget sometimes is that there are millions of people who followed in his example and reached high heights. Reached very high heights. So not to think that we can't do it. There are certain things. There are levels, right, that we can't, that are very difficult for us. But when you, by virtue of you removing certain barriers, the next ones get easy. The next levels get very easy. So you right now, you might not be able to see, like, how can I, even something as simple as, how can I serve my parents because I don't feel like I have a strong relationship with them? And he commands us, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to be dutiful to your parents. Right? That you start small. That you start with, establishing that habit of, saying salam to them, or even just serving them or cooking for them when they don't ask for it. And then eventually you build that relationship to a point where it becomes easy to realize, okay, wait, I have immense love for my parents. Right? And it's sad that we have to say that, but it's a reality a lot of people have. So hopefully, inshallah, that answered your question. Anything else? I think we just have about 5 minutes. Okay, so we can break for Maghrib, and then again, no obligation for anybody who has to go. We have food, we have pizza in the back after Maghrib. We'll have food, and then we'll just do about 10 minutes of adhkar before we